The wind did not howl so much as it whispered, a thin, cold sound that slipped through the cracks in the stone walls of the keep. It was a sound that carried a deep tiredness with it, a feeling that was slowly covering the land. Inside, the air was still and carried the smell of old dust and dried herbs. The only light came from a single, sputtering candle on a large wooden desk, its flame fighting bravely against the deep shadows of the room. This was the home of the Sorceress. Her name was Ilara, and she was the guardian of this valley and the small village that lay in its heart. But tonight she felt like no guardian at all. She sat at her desk, her shoulders slumped, her head resting heavily in one hand. Before her lay open books, their pages filled with complex symbols and powerful words. Small clay pots and glass bottles held strange ingredients, powders that shimmered, roots that looked like tiny old men, and petals from flowers that only bloomed under the light of the moon. For many weeks, a strange gloom had fallen over the land. People called it the miasma. It was not a sickness you could see, like a fever or a cough. It was a sickness of the spirit. It made the sun feel less warm, the food taste less good, and the laughter of children sound quiet and far away. It made people feel heavy, as if they were walking through deep water and their dreams were empty and gray. Ilara had fought this gloom with all her strength. She had made potions for the villagers to drink, which gave them a little energy for a short while. She had spoken great spells of protection, sending waves of her own power out over the valley to push the miasma back, but it was like trying to hold back the tide with her bare hands. For every bit of gloom she pushed away, more would creep back in. She was trying to fill a bucket that had a hole in the bottom. The real cost was written on her face. Her eyes, once bright and full of fire, were now shadowed by deep, dark circles. Her hands, which usually moved with grace and purpose when she worked her magic, now trembled with a fine shake. She was so tired. She could not remember the last time she had enjoyed a full night of peaceful sleep. When she did manage to close her eyes, her rest was filled with worried dreams of failing her people. She pushed herself away from the desk with a sigh that seemed to come from the very bottom of her soul. The floor was cold beneath her bare feet as she walked to the large open window. She looked out over her valley. On a normal night, she would see the warm, golden lights from the village windows dotting the darkness like little stars. Tonight, only a few weak lights flickered. The village was going to sleep early, defeated by the weight of the day. "I am failing them," she whispered to the night air, her voice rough from lack of use. The wind, that cold whisper, was her only answer. High up on the back of a worn velvet-covered chair, a pair of bright green eyes watched her. They belonged to Onyx, her cat. He was as black as a midnight without stars, with fur so dark it seemed to swallow the faint candlelight. He had been with her for years, a quiet presence in the noisy solitude of her work. Most of the time he was just a cat, sleeping in sunbeams, chasing dust motes, and demanding to be fed. But sometimes, in moments like this, he was something more. He did not move or make a sound. He simply watched her with an ancient, deep knowing in his gaze, as if he understood the heavy burden she carried better than anyone else in the world. Ilara turned from the window, the cold seeping into her bones. She decided to try one more time. She had found an old, almost forgotten spell, a charm of brilliant light meant to burn away the shadows of the mind. She stood in the center of the room, took a deep, shaking breath, and began to speak the words. Her voice started low but grew stronger as she raised her hands, pulling energy from deep within herself. A soft golden light began to glow between her palms. It flickered, growing, reaching out tendrils of hope into the dark room. For a moment she felt a spark of her old power, but the effort was too much. Her focus, worn thin by weeks of exhaustion, snapped. The light in her hands wavered wildly, like a candle in a strong wind, and then with a sharp pop it vanished completely. The room felt darker than before. The failure was the final weight she could not carry. All the fear, the frustration, the sheer tiredness crashed down upon her at once. A small broken sound escaped her lips. Her legs could no longer hold her, and she sank to her knees on the cold stone floor. She buried her face in her hands, and for the first time she let the tears come. They were hot and silent, falling for the villagers she could not help, for her own lost strength, and for the deep, lonely silence of the keep. She did not know how long she stayed there, lost in her despair, but then she felt a soft pressure against her side. She lowered her hands. Onyx was there. He had climbed down from his chair and come to her. He rubbed his head against her arm, his body moving in a slow, gentle circle around her. Then he settled himself in her lap, a warm, heavy weight. He looked up at her face, his green eyes glowing in the dim light, and he began to purr. It was not a normal cat's purr. It was a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate not just in the air, but in the very stones beneath her, in the marrow of her bones. It was a steady, rhythmic rumble that filled the terrible silence. It did not take her sadness away, but it sat with her in it. The sharp edges of her panic began to soften. The frantic, racing thoughts in her mind began to slow down, soothed by that constant, gentle sound. Without thinking, her trembling hand moved to stroke the soft fur between his ears. Onyx pushed his head against her fingers, his purr growing even louder, a quiet engine of comfort in the dark. And in that moment, something small, but significant, happened. For the first time in a month, the tight knot of worry in Alara's chest began to loosen. The crushing weight on her shoulders felt just a little bit lighter. She was still tired, and the problem was still there, but the overwhelming feeling of being completely alone in her fight, that feeling had gone. She sat on the floor holding her cat, listening to his purr, and simply breathed. It was not a solution, but it was a start. It was a moment of peace in a long, long war, and for now that was enough. The sorceress did not know how long she stayed there on the cold floor. Time seemed to have lost its meaning. The only real things in the world were the solid weight of the cat in her lap, the softness of his fur under her fingers, and that deep, steady purr that vibrated through her entire body. It was a sound that did not ask for anything. It did not demand that she get up and try another spell. It did not remind her of her failures. It simply was. It was a sound of pure being, of comfort. And slowly it began to quiet the storm inside her mind. Her tears slowed, and then they stopped. The harsh, ragged feeling of her breathing softened into something more normal. She was still so very tired, but the sharp, panicked edge of her exhaustion had been smoothed away. She looked down at the cat, who gazed back at her with those unblinking green eyes. In the quiet of the moment, a new thought, a strange thought, began to form in her mind. This was not the first time she had felt this. There had been other nights, other times when her work had left her feeling drained and hopeless. She would sit at her desk, her head in her hands, and this same cat would appear. He would jump onto the desk and walk slowly across her papers, not in a mischievous way, but with a quiet purpose. He would settle himself right in the middle of her work and begin to purr. She had always shooed him away gently, thinking he was just being a cat, wanting attention. She would go back to her complicated books and powerful potions, ignoring the simple comfort he offered. But now, she really listened. This purr was different. It felt intentional. It felt like it had a shape to it, a gentle magic all its own. It was not a loud or flashy magic. It was a quiet magic, the kind that works in the spaces between heartbeats. Hesitantly, she closed her eyes and focused only on the sound. She imagined it not as a noise, but as a soft golden light. She pictured this light flowing from the cat, seeping into her, warming her cold, tired bones. She felt it soothing the aching muscles in her shoulders and calming the frantic whirl of thoughts in her head. It was a magic of peace. It was a magic of rest. Her eyes fluttered open. The cat Onyx was still watching her. He gave a slow, deliberate blink as if he understood exactly what she was thinking. Then he stood up, stretched his back in a graceful arch, and jumped lightly off her lap. He did not go back to his chair. Instead, he walked over to a low, crowded bookshelf in the darkest corner of the room. This was where she kept her oldest things, the books and scrolls from her earliest days of learning magic. They were simple books for beginners, filled with the first spells she had ever learned. Spells to make a single flower bloom, to find a lost needle, or to brew a tea that helped with a good night's sleep. She had not looked at them in years. She considered them childish, not powerful enough for a problem as big as the miasma. Onyx sat down in front of the shelf. He looked at her, then back at the shelf. He let out a small, quiet murrow sound. "What is it?" the sorceress asked, her voice a hoarse whisper. The cat lifted a paw and tapped it gently against the spine of one particular book. It was a thin, leather-bound book with no title. The cover was worn soft with age. Curiosity, a feeling she had almost forgotten, stirred within her. She pushed herself up from the floor, her body stiff and protesting, and walked over to the shelf. She knelt down, her knees cracking. Onyx rubbed against her side, purring again, encouraging her. She pulled the book from its place. A small cloud of dust puffed into the air. She opened it. The pages were filled with her own handwriting, from when she was just a girl. The letters were large and a little clumsy. She flipped through the pages. There were spells for sweet dreams. There were instructions for making a dream catcher from willow branches and silver thread. There were recipes for simple teas made from chamomile and lavender, herbs that promoted calm and sleep. She had once known these things. She had once believed in this gentle, quiet magic. She looked at Onyx, who was now sitting very straight, his tail wrapped neatly around his feet. He looked like a tiny, furry king on a throne of dust and old books. "You have been trying to show me this all along, haven't you?" she said to him, her voice full of wonder. The cat simply blinked his slow blink again. She had been fighting a battle of force against force. She had been using loud, bright, powerful magic to push against the gloom, but the gloom was not a wall to be broken. It was more like a deep tiredness that had settled over the land. You cannot fight tiredness with shouting. You fight it with rest. You fight it with sleep. You fight it with quiet and peace. Her grand, complicated spells were like trying to hammer a delicate lock. The simple, gentle magic in this old book and in the purr of her cat was like finding the right key. A new kind of hope, fragile but real, began to bloom in her chest. It was not the fierce, burning hope of a warrior, but the soft, quiet hope of someone who has finally found the right path after being lost for a very long time. She carried the book back to her desk, the cat following at her heels. She cleared a space among the grand, complicated spellbooks and lit a fresh candle. She would not try to conquer the miasma tonight. She would not try any great magic at all. Tonight she would follow her cat's advice. She would try something simple. She would try to sleep. And for the first time in weeks, the thought of closing her eyes did not fill her with dread, but with a gentle sense of possibility. The deepest magic, it seemed, was not always the loudest. Sometimes it was a quiet rumble in the dark, and a friend who refused to let you face the night alone. The sorceress sat at her desk, the old, soft-covered book open before her. The candlelight danced across the pages, making her own youthful handwriting seem to sway and move. It felt strange reading these words from so long ago. They were simple, gentle instructions, so different from the powerful and complex spells she had been struggling with for weeks. Onyx, the cat, had not left her side. He had settled himself on the corner of the desk, just outside the circle of candlelight, a silent, dark shadow. His presence was no longer just comforting. It now felt like a guide. His green eyes reflected the flame, watching her every move. She turned a page and her finger stopped under a simple heading: "A tea for peaceful rest." The recipe was straightforward. It called for chamomile flowers, a pinch of dried lavender, and a single petal from a moon petal flower, a soft white flower that only opened fully at night. She had all these things. They were common herbs, the kind she used for minor aches or to calm a nervous villager. She had never considered using them for herself, and certainly not to fight a great evil like the miasma. It felt too small, too simple. A quiet voice in the back of her mind, the voice that always pushed her to do more, to be stronger, whispered that this was foolish. How could a cup of tea fight a gloom that was stealing the joy from an entire valley? She looked up at Onyx. He was washing one paw, looking completely at ease. He seemed to have no doubt at all. He paused his washing, looked directly at her, and let out that soft, questioning murrow, as if to say, "Well, what are you waiting for?" So she pushed her doubts aside. She stood up and went to her shelves of ingredients. She found the jar of chamomile, its small, daisy-like flowers smelling faintly of apples. She pinched some brittle lavender buds, their scent a wave of calm. Finally, from a special box lined with velvet, she took a single silvery white moon petal. It was cool to the touch and seemed to hold the light of the moon within it. She moved slowly, methodically. She did not rush. She filled a small copper pot with water from a pitcher and hung it over the fire that now burned more warmly in the hearth. As she waited for the water to heat, she crushed the herbs gently in her mortar, releasing their sweet, sleepy smells into the air. The simple, familiar actions were soothing in themselves. When the water was steaming, she poured it into a clay cup and added the crushed herbs. The air filled with a gentle, floral scent that seemed to push back the stale, tired air of the room. She carried the cup back to her desk and sat down. The book had one more instruction. Below the recipe, in her young handwriting, it said, "As the tea steeps, speak a lullaby. Not a spell of power, but a song of comfort. Let the words be soft. Let them be a key to unlock sleep. A lullaby." She had not sung one since she was a child. She felt a little silly. She was a sorceress, a protector of the valley. She spoke words of power that could change the weather or call light into darkness. Singing a gentle song felt strange. But then Onyx began to purr. It was the same deep, resonant purr as before, but now it seemed to mix with the steam rising from the cup of tea. It wove itself into the quiet of the room, creating a melody without notes. It was an invitation. She took a deep breath, smelling the chamomile and lavender. She closed her eyes for a moment, pushing her pride away. She thought not of being a powerful sorceress, but of being a tired person who needed rest. She thought of the tired villagers in their homes, and the tired earth outside. She opened her eyes, looked into the steam, and began to sing. Her voice was rough and quiet at first, unused to such softness. Sleep, the day is done now, rest. Beneath the moon. Let your worries fade now. Morning will come soon. The words were simple, almost childish, but as she sang them, something began to happen. The purring of the cat grew louder, wrapping around her voice, supporting it. The candle flame on her desk steadied, burning with a calm golden light. The shadows in the room seemed to stop their restless dancing and settled into soft, gentle shapes. She took the cup in her hands. It was warm, a comforting heat that seeped into her cold fingers. She brought it to her lips and drank. The tea tasted of summer fields and quiet nights. It was not a powerful potion that burned with energy. It was a warm, soft blanket for her insides. She finished the cup and set it down. The lullaby was over, but the feeling it created hung in the air. The purring of the cat was the only sound, a steady rhythmic beat that seemed to be the very heart of the quiet night. A deep, heavy tiredness began to wash over her. But this was different from the exhausting collapse she had felt earlier. That had been a falling apart. This was a gentle sinking. It was a welcome feeling, like finally lying down in a soft bed after a very long, hard day. Her eyelids felt as heavy as stones. Her head nodded forward. She knew she would not make it to her bed in the next room. It was too far away. The chair she sat in felt comfortable enough. She rested her head on her arms, folded on the desk. The world was becoming soft and blurry. The last thing she was aware of was the feeling of Onyx moving. He stepped closer, his soft fur brushing against her cheek. He settled himself right beside her head, and his purr was the last sound she heard, a gentle rumble that seemed to pull her down, into a deep and waiting darkness. But a strange thing happened. As her body fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, her mind did not. A part of her, her conscious self, remained awake. It was as if a second version of her was sitting up, looking at her own sleeping body slumped over the desk. She was in the chair, but she was also standing beside it. She looked at her sleeping form and she looked at the cat. Onyx was also there, sitting on the desk, but he was different. In the strange waking dream, he seemed to glow with a soft internal light. His black fur was sprinkled with tiny points of light like stars in a night sky. He was larger, more powerful looking. He looked at her, his starry eyes bright, and gave a flick of his tail. He was ready, and he was waiting for her to follow. The real journey, it seemed, was just about to begin. The sorceress looked down at her own sleeping body. It was the strangest feeling she had ever known. Her physical self was slumped on the desk, breathing deeply and peacefully. One hand curled loosely near the empty clay cup, but the part of her that was thinking and feeling, her true self, was standing beside the chair, as solid and real as she had ever been. She looked at her hands. They looked the same, but they seemed to be made of a softer, lighter material. She felt no tiredness here. The heavy exhaustion that had been her constant companion for weeks was gone. In its place was a quiet alertness, a feeling of being more awake than she had ever been. Her eyes moved to the cat, Onyx. He sat on the desk, right next to her sleeping head. In this place, this strange state between waking and dreaming, he was transformed. He was no longer just a black cat. His fur was the deep black of a midnight sky, and scattered through it were tiny, shimmering points of light, like 1,000 captured stars. He was larger, his shoulders more powerful, and his green eyes shone with an ancient, intelligent light. He was not just a familiar anymore. He looked like a creature of legend, a guide from a forgotten world. He gave a low, soft chirp and hopped down from the desk. His paws made no sound on the stone floor. He walked towards the large open window and then looked back at her, his starry tail giving a graceful flick. The meaning was clear. Come." She followed him, her own steps silent. When they reached the window, she expected to see the familiar view of her valley and the sleeping village below. But the world outside was not the world she knew. The land was there, but it was different. It was a dream version of her home. The colors were both muted and more vivid at the same time. The trees of the Silverwood shimmered with a soft silver light, but their leaves looked like they were made of dark green glass. The river that cut through the valley flowed not with water, but with liquid moonlight, a slow glowing stream. The sky above was a deep velvety purple with no moon or stars, yet the entire landscape was lit by this strange internal glow. But this beautiful, dreamlike place was sick. Crawling over everything was a gray, sticky substance. It looked like thick, dusty cobwebs, or like the gray moss that grows on old stones in deep shade. It coated the leaves of the glass trees, making them look dull. It lay over the fields like a nasty fog. This was the miasma, she realized. This was what it looked like in the world of dreams. It wasn't just a feeling of tiredness. It was a physical thing, smothering the color and life from the dreamscape. Onyx made a low sound in his throat, a gentle growl of disapproval. He started to walk forward, not down the path, but straight towards the window ledge. For a moment, the sorceress thought he would fall, but as his front paws stepped into the open air, he did not fall. He walked onto it as if it were solid ground. She gasped. He turned and looked at her, waiting. She understood. The normal rules were gone here. She took a hesitant step forward, putting a hand out onto the empty space beyond the window. It felt firm, like cool, smooth glass. She took a breath and stepped out. She was standing on the air, high above her own keep. The world spread out below her, a breathtaking and heartbreaking sight. The village was there, but the houses looked like they were made of pale, sleeping breath. From the chimney of one, instead of seeing a dream of warm, cooking smoke, she saw a thin, gray wisp of worry seeping out. From another, a faint gray cloud of sadness hung over the roof. "These are their dreams," she whispered, her heart aching. "The miasma is poisoning their dreams." Onyx nodded his great starry head. He led her forward, walking on the air as if it were a solid path. They moved towards the village. As they drew closer to the first house, the wall of the dream house seemed to become as thin as mist. She could see inside. A young baker who in the waking world always had a smile and a warm roll for the children was in his dream. But he wasn't dreaming of baking wonderful bread. He was standing in his dream bakery, but the oven was cold and black. The dough on the table was hard as a rock. He was just staring at it, his dream face empty. His shoulders slumped. There was no joy, no purpose. The gray gloom filled the room like a dust. They moved to the next house. A woman who was known for her beautiful weaving was in her dream. But her loom was tangled with gray, lifeless thread. She wasn't creating anything. She was just sitting there, pulling at the tangled threads with a look of deep frustration on her face. House after house, it was the same. The dreams of her people were not nightmares of monsters and fear. They were worse. They were dreams of nothing. Dreams of emptiness. Dreams where all the color, all the creativity, and all the hope had been drained away, leaving only a flat, gray tiredness. The sorceress felt a tear roll down her cheek. A tear that felt real even in this dream world. She had been trying to fight this with bright lights and loud spells in the waking world. But the real battle was here, in this quiet, hidden place. She had been fighting the symptom, not the sickness itself. Onyx rubbed his head against her leg, a gesture of comfort that was the same whether he was a small cat or a great, starry beast. He then lifted his head and looked deeper into the valley towards the heart of the Silverwood. A deep, thick pulse of gray gloom seemed to be flowing from there, seeping out and covering the land like a slow, poisonous river. That was the source. That was where they needed to go. He began to walk again, his pace more determined. The sorceress followed, her own resolve hardening. She finally understood the true nature of her enemy. It wasn't a beast to be slain. It was a deep spiritual wound that was leaking despair into the dreams of everyone she was sworn to protect. And as she walked beside her glowing feline guide, she knew that the simple magic of the tea and the lullaby had been the only key that could have unlocked this door. The grand magic would have been too loud, too harsh for this delicate, wounded realm. For this, they needed the quietest magic of all. Trees here were immense, their trunks like pillars of polished obsidian, and their leaves whispered secrets in a language just beyond understanding. But the gray gloom was thick here, clinging to the bark like a disease and hanging from the branches in sad, tattered curtains. With every step they took towards the heart of the forest, the air grew heavier. It was not a physical weight, but a weight on the soul. It was the feeling of a forgotten promise, of a joy that had been lost and could not be remembered. The sorceress felt it trying to press down on her, to push her into that same empty tiredness she had seen in the villagers' dreams. She focused on the soft, shimmering light of Onyx's fur and the memory of his purr, using it as a shield against the despair. The forest began to change. The glass-like leaves gave way to twisted, thorny branches that reached for them like bony fingers. The ground beneath their feet, which had been firm, now felt soft and spongy, as if they were walking on something sick. The light from the river of moonlight faded, and they moved into a deep, oppressive darkness, broken only by Onyx's gentle glow. Soon they could go no further on foot. A wall of thick, tangled roots, black and slick with the gray gloom, blocked their path. It was a fortress of sorrow. From behind this wall came a slow, rhythmic sound. Thump, drag, thump, drag. It was the sound of a wounded heart struggling to beat. Onyx approached the wall of roots. He did not hiss or growl. He simply sat before it, his starlit tail wrapped around his feet. He closed his eyes, and the deep, resonant purr that had comforted the sorceress in her keep began to rumble from him once more. This time it was different. It was a purr of healing, of gentle pressure. The sound waves, visible as soft golden ripples in the dream air, flowed towards the tangled roots. Where the golden ripples touched the gloom, the gray substance did not vanish, but it recoiled, pulling back like a snail touching salt. It did not want this warmth, this vibration of life. Slowly, a small opening appeared in the wall, just large enough for them to pass through. Onyx opened his eyes, looked at the sorceress, and stepped through the gap. She followed, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and awe. They found themselves in a vast, circular clearing. In the center of the clearing lay the source of all the misery. It was not a monster. It was a spirit, the earth spirit of the Silverwood. In stories, this spirit was described as a magnificent, glowing creature of light and leaf. But the being before them now was shrunken, its form faded and indistinct like a dying ember. It was curled in on itself, asleep. But its sleep was not peaceful. It twitched and shuddered with every labored breath. And at the very core of its being, where its heart should have been, there was a great crystalline heart. It was beautiful, or it should have been, but a deep, jagged crack ran through its center. From this crack, the gray gloom seeped out in a slow, constant stream, like black smoke from a cold fire. Each pulse of the wounded heart pushed more of the despair out into the dream world, which then spread to poison the dreams of every living thing in the valley. The sorceress understood everything in a single, heartbreaking moment. The miasma was not an attack from the outside. It was a sickness from within. The land itself was wounded. The earth spirit, the very soul of the valley, was broken-hearted, and its pain was leaking out, infecting everyone. She looked at her own hands, remembering the powerful, forceful spells she had tried to use. She had been shouting at a crying child to be quiet instead of finding out why it was hurt. A feeling of deep shame washed over her. She had failed to see the truth. She took a step forward, her instinct to help, to fix. She raised a hand, thinking of a spell of mending, a charm to seal the crack with pure magic. A bolt of silver energy like liquid metal shot from her fingertips towards the crystal heart. The result was instant and terrible. The moment her forceful magic touched the crack, the earth spirit let out a silent scream of agony that she felt in her own soul. The spirit convulsed, and from the crack a violent wave of pure gloom erupted, thick and choking. It slammed into her, throwing her backwards. It felt like being hit by all the sadness and despair of the village at once. It was cold and hopeless, and it whispered to her that nothing could ever be fixed, that all efforts were useless. She lay on the ground, stunned and defeated. Her magic had only made it worse. She had hurt the very thing she was trying to save. Onyx was at her side in an instant. He did not look at her with anger, but with patience. He nudged her gently with his head, then turned to face the wounded spirit. He began to purr again, but this time he also began to knead the dream earth with his powerful front paws. It was the same motion a small cat makes when it is content, but here, it was an act of creation. Where his paws touched the ground, threads of light sprang up from the earth. They were not the bright, harsh light of her spell. They were soft threads of starlight, of forgotten laughter, of the memory of a warm sunrise. He looked at her, then at the threads, and then back at her. He was not a warrior. He was a weaver, and he was showing her how to weave. The grand complicated magic was useless here. This was not a battle to be won with strength. This was a wound that needed to be bandaged with the gentlest of things. It needed to be soothed, not sealed shut with brute force. Slowly, shakily, the sorceress got to her feet. She approached the threads of light. She reached out a hand, not to command them but to feel them. They were warm and soft against her fingers like the feeling of hope. She understood now. She looked towards the village, towards the sleeping minds of her people. Even in their gray dreams there were tiny, hidden sparks. A memory of a child's smile, the love for a friend, the simple joy of a good meal. She took a deep breath, let go of all her power as a sorceress, and reached for her humanity instead. She began to hum the lullaby she had sung in her keep. And as she hummed, she began to gently pull the threads of light from the air, from the earth, from the very fabric of the dream. She began to weave. The sorceress's fingers moved through the threads of light. They were not like normal thread. They were warm and hummed with a soft energy, like the feeling of a happy memory. As she hummed her lullaby, the threads responded, weaving together more easily. She was not a skilled weaver like the woman in the village, but here, in this dream, her intent was enough. She was not making cloth. She was making a blanket of comfort. Onyx worked beside her. His purr was the steady rhythm of the loom. With his claws, which shone like tiny slivers of moon, he would gently catch a thread and pull it into place. He did not tear or force them. He guided them, his movements graceful and sure. Where the sorceress's work was a little clumsy, his was perfect. Together they began to create a tapestry of dreams. At first it was just a small glowing square, but as they worked it grew. The sorceress closed her eyes and thought of the good things, the things the gloom had tried to erase. She thought of the taste of fresh bread from the baker's oven on a cold morning. A thread of golden light, warm and comforting, wove itself into the tapestry. She thought of the sound of children laughing as they played in the meadow. A few threads of bright, bubbly blue joined the gold, adding a sense of joy. She remembered the feeling of the sun on her face after a long winter, and a soft yellow thread full of warmth was pulled into their work. She gathered the quiet pride of the woodcarver finishing a piece, the simple contentment of a farmer seeing his fields grow, the love a mother felt holding her child. Each of these feelings became a color, a texture in the growing tapestry. It shimmered with all the emotions that made life worth living, all the things the gray gloom had stolen. This was the magic. Not a spell of mending, but an act of remembering. They were gathering all the lost happiness of the valley and weaving it into a single powerful thing. But the gloom did not like this. It was a creature of emptiness, and this creation of light and feeling was a threat. As their tapestry grew, the gray substance around the clearing began to stir. It thickened and coiled like smoke, forming vague, shadowy shapes. They had no faces, no real forms, but they reached out with long, thin arms, trying to snuff out the light. A tendril of gloom lashed out towards the sorceress. Cold fear gripped her heart, and her humming faltered. The thread in her hand flickered. In a flash, Onyx was there. He moved between her and the gloom. He did not attack it with tooth and claw. Instead, he planted himself firmly, fluffed out his starry fur to make himself look even bigger, and let out a sound that was not a hiss, but a deep, rumbling growl. It was the same sound he had used to comfort her, but now it was a wall, a declaration. It was a sound that said, "This light is under my protection." The growl vibrated through the dream air, and the tendril of gloom recoiled, dissolving back into mist. It could not stand against such a strong, positive feeling. The gloom could feed on sadness and weakness, but it had no power against courage and love. Heartened, the sorceress found her voice again. Her lullaby grew stronger, more confident. She was no longer just humming a song. She was singing a song of defiance, a ballad of all the good things in her valley. Onyx stood guard, his growl a constant low thunder that kept the shadows at bay. He would glance back at her, his starry eyes full of encouragement, and then turn his fierce gaze back to the swirling gloom. They worked as one, she, the weaver of memories, he, the guardian of the light. Finally, the tapestry was complete. It was not huge, but it glowed with an intense, gentle power. It was a soft, shimmering blanket of every beautiful feeling they had gathered. Holding it between them, they could feel it pulsing with warmth, like a living heart filled with joy. They turned towards the wounded earth spirit. The cracked crystal heart still beat its sad, slow rhythm, leaking despair. The spirit itself whimpered in its painful sleep. This was the moment. The sorceress looked at Onyx. He gave a slow, certain blink. They both knew what to do. There was no force involved, no throwing the tapestry like a net. This was an offering. This was a gift. Together they stepped forward. They lifted the glowing tapestry and, with the utmost care, laid it gently over the cracked and wounded heart of the earth spirit. For a moment, nothing happened. The gloom continued to seep out. The sorceress's hope began to falter, but then the tapestry began to sink. It did not rest on the surface of the crystal. It melted into it like butter on warm bread. The golden threads of warmth flowed into the crack. The blue threads of joy filled the broken spaces. The tapestry of dreams became liquid light, pouring into the wound, seeking out every tiny fracture. The gray gloom, which had been flowing so steadily, sputtered and stopped. The jagged crack in the crystal began to close, sealed from the inside out by the warmth and happiness of 1,000 small memories. It was not a harsh scar, but a beautiful golden seam, like the vein of gold in a piece of rock. A single, powerful pulse of light erupted from the mended heart. It was clean and warm, and it washed over the sorceress and her cat like a wave of pure peace. The battle was over. The healing had begun. The pulse of light that came from the mended heart did not flash and disappear. It spread outwards in a slow, gentle wave, like ripples on a pond after a single, perfect drop of water has fallen. It was a wave of color and warmth, and it washed over everything it touched. The sorceress watched. Her hand still held out from placing the tapestry, her heart filled with a feeling so large she thought it might burst. She watched as the wave of light touched the twisted, thorny branches that surrounded the clearing. The thorns did not break or burn. Instead, they softened, and from their tips, small buds of a soft, glowing green appeared. The buds unfurled into leaves that shimmered with morning dew, even in this dreamlike place. The wave moved outwards beyond the clearing. The sorceress could see its effect spreading through the entire dream forest. The gray gloom which had clung to the trees like a nasty cobweb began to dissolve. It did not vanish in a puff of smoke, but simply faded away, like a bad dream forgotten upon waking. Where it had been, the true colors of the dream world returned, brighter and more beautiful than before. The glass trees now sparkled with an internal fire, and the river of moonlight flowed with a quicker, happier current. But the most wonderful change was happening back in the direction of the village. She turned and, with Onyx by her side, walked back to the edge of the clearing. The wall of roots was gone. In its place was a beautiful archway of flowering vines. They stepped through and looked down upon the sleeping dream houses of the village. Before, the houses had been pale and sickly, leaking gray smoke of worry and sadness. Now they were changing. One by one, they began to glow from within with soft, beautiful colors. From the chimney of the baker's house, a warm, golden light began to rise, carrying the wonderful smell of baking bread. Inside his dream, he was no longer staring at a cold oven. He was pulling perfect, golden brown loaves from a warm, glowing hearth, a huge smile on his face. From the home of the weaver, a brilliant, rainbow-colored light streamed out. In her dream, her loom was no longer tangled. It was filled with the most beautiful cloth she had ever seen, woven with threads of every color imaginable. She was laughing as she worked, her hands moving with joy and skill. All over the village, the gray, empty dreams were blossoming into life. A child's dream filled with flying on the back of a friendly bird. A farmer's dream of a field so full of ripe wheat that it shone like a field of gold. The dreams were no longer flat and empty. They were vibrant, they were joyful, they were full of hope and imagination. The quiet hum of creativity and contentment filled the dream air, a sweet music that replaced the heavy silence of the miasma. The earth spirit itself was transforming. The faded, shrunken form began to grow, filling out with light and substance. Its color returned, a beautiful shifting palette of forest green and rich brown, with hints of flower petal pink and sky blue. It uncurled from its painful ball, stretching like someone waking from a long, restful sleep. It did not open its eyes, but a sigh of deep, profound relief passed through its entire being. Its sleep was now peaceful, its dreams sweet and healing. The golden seam on its heart pulsed softly in time with its steady, strong heartbeat. The sorceress stood there for a long time, just watching. She watched the land heal. She watched her people dream beautiful dreams again. She felt the very air around her become light and easy to breathe. The heavy weight that had pressed down on the valley for so long was gone. It had been lifted. She looked down at Onyx. He was no longer the large, starry panther. He had shrunk back to his normal cat-sized shape, though a few specks of starlight still twinkled in his black fur. He was washing one paw, looking completely ordinary, as if he had not just helped to save the entire valley. He finished his paw, looked up at her, and let out a small, quiet merp, as if to ask, "Well, that worked out, didn't it?" A laugh bubbled up from the sorceress's chest. It was a real laugh, light and free, a sound she had not made in a very long time. She knelt down and scooped him into her arms, burying her face in his soft fur. He began to purr, that same, simple, comforting rumble that had started it all. "Thank you," she whispered into his fur, her voice thick with emotion. "You were right all along." He purred louder, nuzzling against her chin. The quest was over. Their work here was done. The warmth from the healed land was seeping into her own dream self, and she felt a deep pulling tiredness. It was not the exhausting tiredness of before. It was the good, honest tiredness that comes after a long and important job is finished. It was the feeling that it was finally truly time to rest. She knew it was time to go back to the quiet keep, back to her sleeping body, back to the waking world that she now knew would be forever changed. Holding Onyx close, she closed her eyes and let the peace of the healed dream carry her away. The feeling of returning was like slowly floating up from the bottom of a deep, warm, and peaceful lake. The beautiful colors of the dream world, the glowing trees, the rainbow dreams of the village all began to fade, not into darkness, but into a soft, golden light. The sound of the purring cat was the anchor, the single constant thread that connected her dreaming self to her waking self. She became aware of her body again. She felt the hard wood of the desk under her cheek. She felt the rough texture of her sleeve against her skin. A gentle morning light, the real light of the sun, was warming her back through the large window. She heard the cheerful sound of birdsong from outside, a sound that had been missing for weeks. Slowly, she lifted her head. Her neck was stiff from sleeping in the chair, but her mind was clearer than it had been in months. It was like a window that had been covered in grime had been washed clean. The heavy gray fog of exhaustion was completely gone. She felt rested. Truly deeply rested, she looked down. Onyx was curled in a tight black ball on the desk, right where he had been in the dream. He was fast asleep, his sides rising and falling in a slow, peaceful rhythm. He looked like any ordinary cat taking a morning nap. She smiled, a soft, genuine smile that reached her eyes. She reached out a hand and gently stroked the space between his ears. In his sleep, he let out a tiny, contented sigh and pushed his head against her fingers. Then, she noticed the rest of the room. The candle on her desk had burned all the way down, a small pool of hardened wax around its base. The air in the room did not feel still and heavy anymore. It felt fresh. A gentle breeze drifted in through the open window, carrying with it the clean smell of damp earth and growing things. It was the smell of the world after a long-needed rain. She stood up, her body feeling lighter. She walked to the window and looked out over her valley. The difference was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, but it was everywhere. The sun, which for weeks had seemed pale and weak, now shone with a strong golden light. It made the leaves on the trees look a vibrant, waxy green. Down in the village, she could see people moving about. She saw the baker standing outside his shop, not with slumped shoulders, but with his hands on his hips, looking up at the sky with a smile. She saw a group of children running down the path, their movements quick and lively, not slow and heavy. She saw the weaver hanging a newly finished cloth outside her door, its colors bright and bold even from a distance. The miasma was gone. The gloom had lifted. The valley was waking up. A feeling of deep, quiet joy filled the sorceress's chest. It was a feeling so pure and so strong that it brought fresh tears to her eyes, but this time, they were tears of relief. She had not done this with a great and powerful spell. She had done it by listening. She had done it by learning a quieter, gentler kind of magic. She thought about the earth spirit now sleeping peacefully with its mended heart. She knew that the healing of the land would take time, but the sickness was over. The poison had been stopped. The people's spirits were healing, and that would help the land, and the land's health would, in turn, help the people. It was a beautiful, gentle cycle, the opposite of the terrible cycle of the miasma. Her eyes fell on the old, simple spell book still lying open on her desk. Next to it sat the empty clay cup that had held the dream tea. These simple things, which she had once thought were useless, had been the keys to saving everything. She walked over and closed the book, running her hand over its soft, worn cover with a new sense of respect. She then looked at the grand, complicated spellbooks filled with powerful incantations. They had their place, she knew, but they were like a shout. And sometimes what was needed was not a shout but a whisper. Sometimes what was needed was not a sword but a bandage. Sometimes the most powerful magic was a cup of tea, a soft song, and the purr of a faithful friend. She picked up the sleeping Onyx, cradling him gently in her arms. He was warm and limp with sleep. She carried him out of the study and into her small bedroom. She placed him in the center of her soft bed, where a patch of sunlight was falling. He immediately stretched out, rolling onto his back, his paws in the air, completely safe and content. The sorceress knew that today would be a busy day. The villagers would be curious. They would feel the change and would likely come to her keep, full of questions and renewed energy. There would be work to do, helping to guide this new beginning. But for now, for just a little while longer, she would rest. She lay down on the bed next to her sleeping cat, in the pool of warm sunlight. She closed her eyes, not to escape into a dream, but simply to enjoy the feeling of being awake in a world that was whole again. The deepest magic had done its work, and now, it was time to simply be. The sorceress must have drifted back to sleep, because the next thing she knew, the patch of sunlight on the bed had moved and grown warmer. She opened her eyes to a room filled with bright morning light. Onyx was still sleeping beside her, a soft, rumbling purr coming from his chest. It was the sound of pure contentment. For a long moment, she just lay there listening to that sound and feeling the peace of the keep around her. The silence was no longer heavy or threatening. It was a comfortable, friendly silence, the kind that lets you hear the little sounds of life, the chirp of sparrows outside, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant, happy shout of a child from the village below. Her body still felt the good kind of tired, but her mind was alert and clear. She knew the people would be coming. They would feel the change in the air, the lightness in their own hearts, and they would want to understand what had happened. She got up, moving quietly so as not to disturb the cat, and went to wash her face and put on a clean robe. For the first time in weeks, she did not have to force her body to move. It felt like a natural thing to do. She had just finished braiding her hair when she heard the first sounds from outside. It was not a single voice, but a murmur, like the hum of bees. She walked to her front door, took a deep breath, and opened it. A small crowd had gathered in the clearing before her keep. It was not the entire village, but a group of people, their faces filled with a cautious wonder. They were the same people she had seen in their dreams, the baker, the weaver, the woodcarver, mothers and fathers. But they were transformed. Their shoulders were straight, their eyes were bright, and there were real smiles on their faces. The gray veil had been lifted from them all. The baker stepped forward, clutching his hat in his hands. "Sorceress," he began, his voice full of emotion. We woke up this morning and it was different. The sun felt warm. My wife was singing. The children ran outside to play before they had even eaten their breakfast." He looked around at the others, who nodded in agreement. "We felt we had to come. To thank you. Whatever great magic you did last night, it worked." The sorceress looked out at their hopeful, grateful faces. She felt a warmth spread through her chest. But she knew she had to tell them the truth. She shook her head gently. "Thank you," she said, her voice clear and calm. "But I cannot take the credit for a great magic. The truth is, my great magic had failed." A confused murmur went through the crowd. She continued. "The sickness, the miasma, was not a beast to be fought with power. It was a wound in the spirit of the land itself. I had been trying to shout at a wound to make it heal." She gestured for them to come closer, and they gathered around, their faces curious. "Last night I did not use a powerful spell. I learned to listen. I made a simple tea from chamomile and lavender. I sang an old lullaby, and I listened to the quiet wisdom of a friend." As if on cue, Onyx padded out of the open door. He stretched his front legs, arching his back, and then sat down neatly at the sorceress's feet. He looked at the crowd of people with his calm green eyes and then began to wash a paw, completely unbothered by the attention. The villagers looked at the ordinary black cat and then back at the sorceress. The weaver spoke up, her voice soft. "You mean the healing came from quiet things?" "Yes," the sorceress said, a smile touching her lips. "It came from rest. It came from peace. The magic was in remembering the simple joys, the taste of your bread, the beauty of your cloth, the love for your children. That is the magic that mended the valley's heart. She did not tell them about the dream world or the earth spirit or the starry form of her cat. Those were secrets for her to keep. The important lesson, the one they could all understand, was the one she shared now. The miasma fed on our tiredness and our worry, she explained. It could not survive when we remembered how to be happy, how to rest, how to dream good dreams again. The greatest protection for our valley is not a powerful shield, but our own collective joy. The people listened, and you could see the understanding dawn on their faces. It was a different kind of magic, one they could all practice. It was not something only the sorceress could do. It was something they all held within them. The baker laughed, a hearty, full-bellied laugh. Well, in that case I shall bake an extra batch of sweet rolls today. We have something to celebrate. The weaver nodded. And I will hang the brightest cloth I have on my door. A happy chatter broke out among the people. They began to talk not about their fears, but about their plans for the day, about the small beauties they would create. They bowed their heads to the sorceress in thanks, their gratitude even deeper now that they understood, and then they turned and walked back down the path towards the village. Their steps light and their voices cheerful. The sorceress watched them go. Onyx rubbed against her leg and she bent down to pick him up. She held him close as they watched the village come to life, more vibrant than it had been in a very long time. She had not just healed the valley. She had learned a new way to protect it, and she had learned that a leader is not always the one who fights the hardest, but sometimes the one who knows when it is time to rest and to listen to the quietest voice in the room, even if it only speaks in a purr. The seasons turned in the valley. The vibrant greens of summer deepened into the gold and red of autumn, and then the quiet white of winter settled over the land. But this winter was different from the last. There was no creeping gloom, no heavy silence. The cold was crisp and clean, and the air was filled with the smell of wood smoke and the sound of families gathered warmly inside their homes. Life for the sorceress had changed in deep and quiet ways. She still practiced her magic. She still helped the villagers with her knowledge, healing sick animals, helping to find water for a new well, and using her arts to ensure the crops would be strong. But her approach was different now. She was no longer the tired, frantic woman trying to hold back the darkness with sheer force. Her keep was no longer a place of frantic energy and cold, forgotten hearths. Now a fire almost always burned warmly. The shelves still held her grand spell books, but they shared space with jars of honey, bundles of drying herbs, and the simple, worn book of gentle magic that had shown her the way. She had become known not just as the sorceress of the Silverwood, but as the keeper of gentle magic. The villagers came to her not only for help, but for advice. A young mother would come holding a restless baby. "The little one will not sleep," the mother would say, her face worried. The sorceress would not reach for a powerful sleeping potion. Instead, she would give the mother a small pouch of chamomile. "Make a weak tea," she would advise. "And when you rock her, hum this simple tune." She would hum a few bars of the lullaby. She taught them that sometimes the magic was in the quiet moment, the soft touch, the patient breath. An old woodcarver, his hands stiff with age and frustration, came to her, unable to finish his work. "My inspiration is gone," he sighed. "The wood feels dead." She did not give him a potion for steady hands. Instead, she told him to put his tools down. "Sit by the window and just watch the birds for an afternoon," she suggested. "Do not try to carve. Just rest your eyes and your mind. The inspiration will return when it is ready." And it did. She taught them that the spirit, like the land, needed to rest to be fruitful. She showed them that forcing a solution was often like trying to force a seed to grow by pulling on it. True growth needed patience and quiet and trust. Her greatest teacher in all of this was always by her side. Onyx continued to be her faithful companion. He was, for all anyone could see, a perfectly ordinary cat. He napped in sunbeams, chased falling leaves in the autumn, and sat by the fire in the winter, mesmerized by the dancing flames. He would still sometimes walk across her important papers, but now she would just smile and move him gently, remembering the night he walked on air. In the evenings, a peaceful routine settled over the keep. After her day's work was done, the sorceress would sit in her chair by the fire. She would perhaps read or simply watch the flames, letting the peace of the day settle into her bones. Without fail, Onyx would jump into her lap, circle once or twice, and settle down into a soft, warm loaf. Then the purring would begin. That deep, resonant purr was the sound of their friendship and the sound of the valley's healing. It was a constant, gentle reminder of the power of quiet things. As she listened to it, she could feel any small worries or tensions from the day simply melt away. It was her daily dose of the gentlest magic there was. One evening, as a soft snow fell outside, blanketing the world in a peaceful hush, she sat like this. The fire crackled, the cat purred, and all was well. She looked around her keep at the simple, comfortable life she had built. She thought of the village where lights glowed warmly from the windows, and she knew the people inside were living their lives, dreaming their dreams, free from the shadow that had once haunted them. She had thought that being a powerful sorceress meant always being ready for a great battle. She had believed her value was in her strength, her complex spells, her ability to fight. But she had been wrong. The truest power, she now knew, was not in the storm, but in the calm that follows. It was not in the shout, but in the whisper that you have to lean in to hear. It was the power of a cup of tea, a shared song, a moment of rest, and the quiet, steadfast loyalty of a friend. It was the power to heal, not just to fight. It was the power to bring peace, not just to wage war. This was a deeper, more lasting magic. It was a magic that did not drain her, but filled her up. She stroked Onyx's soft fur, and he pushed his head against her hand, his purr growing even louder. He opened his eyes halfway and gave her that slow, loving blink that cats reserve for those they trust most. She blinked back slowly, a silent thank you. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the valley in a blanket of quiet. Inside, the fire warmed the room, and the sorceress, with her cat purring on her lap, felt a happiness that was deep and complete. The story of the great battle against the miasma was over, but the story of the gentle magic, the story of a quiet life filled with peace and purpose, that story was just beginning. And it was a story that would last for a very, very long time.